This is the story of the most feared weapon of the Second World War, and of the statistical illusion that turned it into a legend. This is the story of how a few hundred German submarines came to be remembered as the force that nearly starved Britain into surrender, when the numbers, counted honestly, tell a colder and far stranger truth. By the close of May in 1943, the German U-boat arm had lost more than 40 submarines in 31 days. The admiral who commanded them, Karl Donitz, pulled his boats out of the North Atlantic and admitted, in effect, that the campaign had ended. What almost no documentary will tell you is the part that matters most, that by the time this collapse arrived, the U-boats had already been beaten for months. The moment historians point to as the closest Germany ever came to victory, March of 1943, was never the high water mark of a rising tide, and it turned out to be the last convulsion of a weapon that the mathematics of the war had already condemned. Start with the fleet itself, because the fleet is where the myth begins to crack. When Germany went to war on the 1st of September in 1939, the entire U-boat arm, the U-Bootwaffe, numbered around 57 submarines. That figure sounds respectable until you reach the detail the legend always leaves out, that of those 57 boats, only 22 suited service in the open Atlantic. The rest were small coastal craft, handy in the North Sea and useless against convoys 1,000 miles out. Karl Donitz understood exactly what that meant. The commander of the U-boat arm, the Befehlshaber der U-Boot, known simply as BDU, had built an entire theory of victory around a number he did not possess. Donitz wanted 300 ocean-going boats, and he opened the war with fewer than 24 that could even reach the fight. In his own memoirs, the admiral left behind a sentence that ought to hang over this whole story: that seldom has any branch of a country's armed forces gone to war so poorly equipped. That is not the voice of a man who almost won, and it carries the weight of a commander who grasped, from the very first day, that the tool was far too small for the task. The strategy Donitz carried into the war had both a name and a cold logic: the tonnage war, the tonnage Krieg. Borrowed from the German submarine campaign of 1917, the idea ran brutally simple. Britain was an island that imported its food, its fuel, and its raw materials, the very stuff of survival, all of it hauled across the Atlantic. Sink those imports faster than the shipyards of the Allied world could replace them, and the island would starve before it could fight. Donitz phrased it with chilling clarity, calling the enemy's shipping one single, great entity, so that it never mattered where a ship went down, because once destroyed it had to be replaced, and if replacement lagged, the arithmetic would finish the job. Hold on to that word, arithmetic, because the whole question of whether the Wolfpacks almost won comes down, in the end, to an argument about arithmetic. That arithmetic never belonged to Germany. To see how close the campaign truly came, you first have to understand the weapon that made it dangerous, and that weapon was never the submarine itself. It lived in the tactic, a method the Germans named Rudeltaktik, the Wolfpack. A lone submarine hunting by itself across the vastness of the Atlantic counted for almost nothing against a convoy, because the ocean runs too wide and one boat watches only a narrow slice of water. Donitz solved that by turning the U-boat from a lone predator into a system. The admiral strung his boats into long patrol lines, like a rake dragged across the known convoy routes, and the instant one boat sighted a convoy, that boat held its fire. Instead it shadowed the ships, radioed the position back to headquarters, and the U-boat command vectored every other boat within reach toward the target. Here is the first idea worth pausing on, because it reaches straight into a world you already live in. The tonnage war Donitz waged was, at its core, a supply chain attack. The admiral cared about an individual ship no more than a modern logistics analyst frets over a single pallet, since what governed everything was the replacement rate, the flow, the net stock, the gap between what got destroyed and what could be rebuilt. It is the very logic a company like Amazon runs today through predictive logistics, where the enemy is never one lost shipment but the rate at which the shelf empties faster than it refills. Donitz fought an inventory war 2 full generations before the phrase existed, and like every inventory war, it would fall to whichever side could manufacture faster, not to whichever side could destroy more dramatically. Now to the attack itself. When the pack gathered, the boats came in at night and on the surface, and this one detail turned the British sonar called Aztec, which pinged a submerged hull, into something close to useless. Riding the surface, a Type 7 U-boat sat low, dark, and quick, often faster on the water than the escorts hunting it. The sonar strained for something beneath the waves while the Wolfpack slid in over the top, in the dark, running flat like a torpedo boat, so that the convoy's defenders kept looking down as the killers came in level. For a while, and it was only ever a while, the method worked with terrifying efficiency. The proof arrived in the autumn of 1940, and it arrived at a spot on the map marked Convoy SC-7. When France fell in June of 1940, that single event handed the U-boat arm more than any shipyard ever could. Overnight, Donet's submarines gained bases along the French Atlantic coast, at Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux. From the Biscay ports a U-boat could reach the convoy lanes in a fraction of the time the old route around the top of the British Isles demanded, so range doubled and time on station doubled along with it. The killing began in earnest, and the crews handed this stretch a name that tells you everything about how one-sided it felt from inside a conning tower: Die Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. The numbers from that first happy time stayed genuinely brutal. Convoy SC-7 left Nova Scotia in early October of 1940 with 35 merchant ships, and across the nights of the 18th and 19th a Wolfpack tore into it. Out of 35 ships, 20 went to the bottom. The pack was not finished, because it swung onto the next convoy, HX-79, and inside a single stretch of 48 hours the two convoys together lost 28 ships. Not one U-boat went down in exchange. That is the moment the Wolfpack theory looked like prophecy: 28 ships in 2 days for no loss at all. Freeze the war in October of 1940 and ask whether Germany was winning the Atlantic, and the answer would seem obvious. Widen the frame a little, though, and the picture shifts. Across the whole opening stretch of the war, from September of 1939 into the following spring, the U-boats sank over 300 Allied ships while losing only 24 boats in the process, a magnificent exchange rate by any measure. The trouble is that the fleet posting those results was the same fleet that had entered the war with barely 24 Atlantic-capable boats. What people heard in the happy time was never the sound of a war being won, but the sound of a small number of superb crews doing extraordinary damage before the other side learned how to fight back. That exchange rate dazzled. The scale stayed tiny, and in a tonnage war, scale is the only thing that counts. Every legend needs its heroes, and the U-boat war minted a handful of men whose names still carry weight with people who have never opened a naval history book. This is where the myth found its faces. There was Otto Kretschmer, nicknamed Silent Otto, commander of U-99 and the highest-scoring ace of the entire war, credited with roughly 47 ships. There was Gunther Prien, the Bull of Scapa Flow, who in October of 1939 drove U-47 straight into the Royal Navy's home anchorage and sank the battleship Royal Oak at her moorings, killing more than 800 men. Alongside them sailed Joachim Schepke of U-100, Eric Top of U-552, the boat they called the Red Devil, and Wolfgang Luth, the second highest tonnage scorer of the war, credited with well over 200,000 tons. Propaganda built these men into demigods, and here the story has to stay honest about something the record flags plainly, that the tonnage totals pinned to the aces were, in many cases, inflated. Gunther Prien's wartime score was later trimmed downward, from over 200,000 tons to something nearer 160,000. The figures drew argument then and draw argument now, because crews overclaimed and headquarters double-counted, so that even the heroes of the tale arrive pre-exaggerated. A small thing, maybe, yet it carries the same disease that ran through the whole campaign, a legend always sized a little larger than the ledger. Then came March of 1941, and not as a slow decline but as one concentrated catastrophe for the U-boat elite. On the 8th of March, Gunther Prien and U-47 vanished with every hand aboard. 9 days later, on the 17th, in the fighting around convoy HX-112, the British destroyers Walker and Vanek killed Joachim Schepke and captured Otto Kretschmer. Inside a little over a week, the three most famous aces of the war were dead, and imprisoned. Sit with what that meant. A rising force does not surrender its three best commanders in 9 days in early 1941. The Royal Navy was already learning, the escorts were already sharpening their edge, and the men who had written the legend were already dying, with years of war still ahead of them. Now we reach the factor that truly decided the Atlantic, and it was never torpedoes but information. The German U-boat command ran on radio, and it had no choice in the matter. Riddle tactic, the whole Wolfpack system, lived on a constant stream of signals, boats reporting convoy sightings, headquarters vectoring packs to intercept, BDU conducting the battle from a shore bunker hundreds of miles away. Every one of those messages passed through the Enigma cipher machine, and the Germans believed, right to the end, that Enigma could not be broken. They were wrong. At a country house north of London called Bletchley Park, the codebreakers of the Government Code and Cipher School, Alan Turing among them in the naval section known as Hut 8, fought to read the U-boat traffic. The breakthroughs that let them do it never came from pure mathematics alone, because they came from men who died stealing codebooks off sinking submarines. On the 9th of May in 1941, British warships forced U-110 to the surface and boarded her before she sank, lifting out an Enigma machine and its codebooks. On the 30th of October in 1942 came the capture that mattered most of all. The destroyer Petard cornered U-559 in the Mediterranean, and 3 men climbed down into the flooding submarine to retrieve her cipher material: Lieutenant Francis Faw's son, able seaman Colin Grazier, and a 16-year-old canteen assistant named Tommy Brown. Faw's son and Grazier passed the codebooks up through the hatch, and then rowed the boat down. Tommy Brown lived. The material those 2 men drowned for included the short signal weather codebook that Bletchley needed to break its way back into the U-boat's own cipher. Think about the arithmetic of that exchange for a moment. 2 men drowned inside a flooding hull so that a team of analysts in a hut in the English countryside could read the enemy's mail, and it stands as the least cinematic kind of heroism there is. No guns, no charge, only 2 sailors handing paper up a ladder and choosing not to follow it out. The Battle of the Atlantic turned on moments exactly that quiet. Here is the second place the U-boat war reaches straight into your present. The Germans lost, in part, because they could not stop talking. Every Wolfpack depended on radio, and every radio transmission is a beacon, so the Allies built shipborne high-frequency direction-finding gear the sailors nicknamed Huffduff, able to take a bearing on a U-boat the instant it keyed a transmitter. The boat never had to be seen. It only had to speak. That is the exact principle governing the device in your pocket right now. A phone that betrays its location not because anyone can see it, but because it keeps pinging the network. Donet's submarines were geolocated by their own chatter, 70 years before metadata became a household word, and by one study a quarter of all U-boat losses trace, statistically, back to Huffduff. Here is the detail that turns a technical footnote into an indictment. The Germans blamed those losses on Allied radar, never once diagnosing that their own radio traffic gave them away, so they never fixed the leak. The most feared weapon of the war broadcast its own coordinates and never understood why the sky kept falling on it. For a moment in 1942, the killing roared back, and this is the stretch that keeps the almost one story breathing. When the United States entered the war at the close of 1941, Donitz sent his boats west toward the American coast in an operation named Paukenschlag, the drumbeat. The submarines reached the eastern seaboard in January of 1942 and found a country that had not yet paid, in blood, for the lessons Britain already carried. American ports blazed with light, American ships sailed alone and unescorted, their hulls thrown into silhouette against the glow of undimmed coastal cities. The crews christened this second slaughter another happy time, and the numbers came back with a vengeance. The first drumbeat boats arrived in American waters on the 13th of January in 1942, and by the 6th of February they had sent nearly 157,000 tons of shipping to the bottom without a single loss. Along the American coast, across the whole campaign, U-boats sank 397 ships, and in the Gulf of Mexico during May of 1942 alone, 41 vessels went down. 1942 as a whole became the deadliest year of the entire Atlantic War, with U-boats sinking over 6 million tons of Allied shipping, the peak figure of the conflict, and a single month, November of 1942, accounted for more than 729,000 tons of it. That came to over 6 million tons in a single year. If ever a year wore the look of Germany winning the Atlantic, 1942 was that year. Here is the counter number, the one that breaks the spell. In that same year of 1942, at the very height of the slaughter, the shipyards of Britain, the United States, and Canada launched around 7 million tons of new merchant shipping, roughly a million tons more than the U-boats managed to sink. The worst year of the war for Allied shipping was also a year in which the Allied merchant fleet grew larger. Donitz was sinking ships as fast as he ever would, and the shelf kept refilling faster than his boats could empty it. The tonnage war held exactly one victory condition: to sink faster than the enemy could build. In the best year the U-boats ever enjoyed, they lost that race, and everything after 1942 only widened the gap. To see why Germany lost the building race, look at how the two sides actually made their ships, because they were never playing the same game. The Allied answer to the U-boat was not, at heart, a better weapon. It was a factory method. The Liberty ship came deliberately crude, welded and standardized, a cargo vessel designed for an assembly line rather than for shipwrights. 18 American yards turned out 2,710 of them between 1941 and 1945, averaging roughly 3 ships every 2 days, and by 1943 the median build time had fallen to around 40 days. In one publicity stunt, a Liberty ship named the Robert E. Peary went from keel to launch in 4 days and 15.5 hours. This is the industrial logic that would later define the modern world: interchangeable parts, standardized modules, throughput valued over craftsmanship, the same philosophy that lets a modern manufacturer stamp out identical units at continental scale. The United States aimed it at ships. Germany never could. The U-boat was the opposite kind of object, a dense, complex, hand-built machine, and German yards at full stretch produced somewhere around 20 boats a month against a target of 40 they never reliably hit. Picture 20 submarines a month set against 3 cargo ships every 2 days. That is not a contest of courage or seamanship at all, but a contest of throughput, and one side had already won it before the shooting reached its climax. Donitz needed 300 boats to make his arithmetic work, and the brutal truth of his enemy's shipyards was that even 300 would likely not have sufficed, because the replacement rate on the far side of the ocean kept accelerating while his own stood still. For a few weeks in the late winter of 1943, it genuinely looked as though Donitz might be right after all. This is the moment the entire almost won narrative rests on, and it deserves to be told at full weight before anyone takes it apart. By early 1943 the Wolfpacks stood at their largest. From the 1st of February in 1942, the Atlantic boats had shifted to a new 4-rotor Enigma that Bletchley Park labeled Shark, and for most of that year it left the codebreakers blind. The convoys sailed partly in the dark, straight into the largest concentration of U-boats ever gathered in one place. The collision came in March of 1943, around 2 convoys unlucky enough to be routed across the same patch of ocean, HX-229 and SC-122. More than 38 U-boats, formed into 3 packs, converged on roughly 90 merchant ships, and it grew into the largest convoy battle of the entire war. Over a handful of days the Wolfpacks sank 21 merchant ships and lost only 1 submarine in return, and across that whole month the U-boats put more than 600,000 tons on the seafloor. Inside the British Admiralty the reaction ran close to despair. The Royal Navy's own assessment, written afterward, carried a line that has echoed through every history since, that the Germans never came so near to severing the link between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1943. In those weeks the Admiralty is said to have asked itself whether the convoy system could even continue. That phrase, "never came so near," forms the entire foundation of the legend. It is real, set down by serious men in the middle of a genuine crisis, and it stands as the most misleading true sentence in the history of the Battle of the Atlantic. Here is what those men in March of 1943 could not see, and what we can. Even in that catastrophic fight around HX-229 and SC-122, the worst convoy disaster of the war, close to 80% of the ships still got through. The Wolfpacks flung their largest ever concentration at 2 convoys and still failed to halt most of the cargo bound for Britain, and within weeks those same Wolfpacks would be annihilated. Barely any distance separated the nearest moment from the final collapse. That is not the shape of a winning campaign at its peak. It is the shape of a weapon making its most violent lunge precisely because it has already been cornered. The proof arrived at a convoy called ONS-5, and then across the span of a single month the Germans would forever remember as the disaster that ended everything. In late April and early May of 1943, a westbound convoy, ONS-5, ran headlong into a Wolfpack in the mid-Atlantic. On paper it should have become another SC-7, another slaughter, and the convoy did lose 13 ships. This time, though, the escorts and the aircraft killed 6 U-boats in exchange. The pack gave up 6 boats for 13 merchant ships. Measured against the exchange rates of the happy times, where whole convoys were gutted for no loss whatsoever, that trade spelled catastrophe for Germany, because the defenders had stopped merely surviving the Wolfpacks and started destroying them. Then May of 1943 arrived, the month the Germans still call Black May. In those 31 days the U-boat arm lost somewhere between 41 and 43 submarines, about a quarter of its entire operational strength, wiped away inside a single month. Dönitz had opened May with roughly 240 operational boats, more than 100 of them at sea, the largest force he had ever fielded, and it was being slaughtered. On the 24th of May in 1943, Karl Dönitz did the only thing left to him. The admiral ordered the bulk of his U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic, so that the commander who had built the tonnage war, who had wanted 300 boats to strangle an island, hauled his fleet off the main convoy routes and conceded the ocean. What killed them in Black May was never a single weapon but a whole system finally clicking into place. The air gap, that stretch of mid-ocean the Germans named the Black Pit, lying beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, closed at last. Very long-range Liberator bombers flying from Iceland and Newfoundland could finally cover the full width of the crossing, and the number that closed the gap is almost insulting in its smallness. In February of 1943 Britain held only 18 such aircraft, none of them yet working the mid-ocean where it mattered, and even at the peak of the effort the force covering the gap amounted to something like 38 very long-range planes. 38 aircraft stood between the Wolfpacks and the open ocean, and 38 proved enough to break them, because the Wolfpacks had never been anything like as strong as the fear that surrounded them. Stack the rest on top of that. Add the escort carriers now sailing with the convoys, add centimetric radar the German receivers could not even detect, add Huffduff taking a bearing on every transmission, add Bletchley Park back inside the Shark cipher, and the surface night attack, the entire basis of Ruddle tactic, curdled into suicide. The Wolfpack tactic did not fade away. It was killed, inside a single month, by an integrated Allied system that had been assembling in plain sight the whole time. So we reached the question the title of this account places on the table, whether the Wolfpacks almost won the Atlantic, and the honest answer, the one the arithmetic supports, is no, not really, and not ever. Listen to the historian who carried out the most exhaustive study of the U-boat war ever attempted. Clay Blair, across his 2-volume history, set down a verdict as blunt as anything Dönitz wrote, that at no time did the German U-boat force ever come close to winning the Battle of the Atlantic or to bringing about the collapse of Great Britain. Blair's case rests on a number that quietly demolishes the legend, that across the transatlantic convoys, around 99% of all ships reached their destinations. That is 99 out of every 100. The U-boats delayed supplies, frightened an empire, and killed tens of thousands of men, and still they let 99 of every 100 convoyed ships sail safely through. A second number guts the myth, and it is one the wartime propaganda on both sides had every reason to bury. Most of the ships the U-boats sank were never the well-defended vessels sailing inside escorted convoys. They were independents and stragglers, ships traveling alone, or ships that had fallen behind the protection of the group. Those Wolfpacks feasted on the unescorted and the unlucky, and against a properly defended convoy, even at the darkest moment of the war, they mostly failed. The legend of the Wolfpack rests on images of convoys being torn to pieces. The reality is that the convoy, taken as a system, almost always worked. The naval historian Mark Milner delivered the strategic verdict about as flatly as it can be put, writing that the German attack on shipping complicated the management of the Allied war effort, yet for all its drama it exerted no appreciable influence on the outcome of the war. Milner pushed the point deeper still, arguing that victory in the Atlantic was never within Germany's grasp unless the Allies chose to defeat themselves. The historian Alan Lavine arrived at the same ground from another direction, calling the near defeat a misperception and doubting the U-boats ever truly came close. Fairness demands the opposing case be made, because it is far from empty. The traditional view, running from the Admiralty's own reports through the official historian Stephen Roskill, is no fool's position. Britain really did lean absolutely on its imports. The losses of 1942 really were staggering, and the March crisis of 1943 really did shake serious men to the core. The deepest point in that traditional view lands here, that even if the material margin was never as thin as the fear suggested, the U-boat as a threat in being forced the Allies to pour colossal resources into the Atlantic, escorts, aircraft, intelligence, and shipyards, resources that might otherwise have shortened the war elsewhere. By that measure, the U-boats mattered enormously, even in defeat, since they never had to win to be worth building. They only had to make the other side spend. Notice what that concession actually gives away. It shifts the U-boat from war-winning weapon to expensive nuisance that forced the enemy to work hard, which is a real role, though not the role the legend assigns. The gap between almost starved Britain into surrender and forced the Allies to invest heavily in defense is the whole distance between myth and history. So why does the almost one story survive at all? Two reasons, and the record points straight at both. The fear was genuine, first of all, and it was recorded by the most quotable man of the century. That famous line, that the only thing which ever truly frightened him through the war was the U-boat peril, was written by Winston Churchill after the fighting had ended, in his memoirs, by a man renowned for sharpening a point until it drew blood. It is a true record of how the danger felt, not a measurement of how close the danger came. The second reason is secrecy, because for decades the full story simply could not be told, since the deepest Allied advantage of all, the breaking of Enigma at Bletchley Park, stayed classified until the 1970s. Every history written before then had to explain the Allied victory without the single largest reason for it, so writers reached instead for the drama of the convoy battles and the razor's edge of March 1943, and the legend of the almost hardened into fact before the truth was ever let out of the vault. The Wolfpacks did not almost win the Atlantic. They were outbuilt and outnumbered by an industrial machine, they were outthought and outlistened by an intelligence machine, and both of those machines were always going to grind them down. The almost is the residue of real fear and enforced silence, and never a verdict delivered by the arithmetic. There is a number in this story that deserves to be spoken slowly, because it is the one the survivors carried and the one the legend keeps skipping. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, around 30,000 never came home. That came to 3 sailors lost out of every 4. No other major branch of the German armed forces suffered a loss rate anywhere near it across the whole war. Understand what that meant as a lived, daily reality. A U-boat crew formed a small, sealed community, around 50 men inside a Type 7 boat, packed into a steel tube the length of a large house, with no fresh food after the opening days, no bathing, condensation sliding down the hull, diesel fumes soaked into everything, one shared head for the lot of them, and the patient, constant terror of the depth charge. The men living in that tube were, statistically, likelier to die than to survive. When the Wolfpacks were winning, they died at rates their commanders kept hidden, and when the Wolfpacks were losing, through Black May and everything after, whole crews vanished at a stroke, since a submarine lost with all hands leaves nothing behind, no wreck to mourn over, no survivor to carry the letter home. 40 submarines lost in a month means thousands of men gone in 30 days. The legend keeps the aces, the tonnage, the happy times. The ledger keeps the 3/4 who never returned. Both things are true, and only one of them ever made it onto a recruiting poster. The moral weight of the campaign settled, in the end, onto one incident and one trial. On the 12th of September in 1942, a U-boat under Werner Hartenstein, U-156, torpedoed and sank a British liner named the Laconia. What Hartenstein did not know until the ship was already going down was that the Laconia carried around 1,800 Italian prisoners of war. When the commander of U-156 grasped what he had done, he did the very thing the tonnage war was never meant to permit, and he began a rescue. The submarine surfaced, took survivors aboard, radioed for help, and moved across the water flying a Red Cross flag, and an American aircraft, AB-24, bombed the rescuing submarine anyway. Donetsk's response to the Laconia disaster became one of the most closely scrutinized orders of the entire war. 5 days later, on the 17th of September in 1942, the admiral issued what history now calls the Laconia Order, forbidding his crews from mounting rescues of the survivors of ships they sank, and that order followed Donetsk all the way to Nuremberg. When the U-boat chief stood trial after the war, the Laconia Order sat at the center of the charge that he had waged illegal submarine warfare. The judgment the tribunal handed down runs more careful, and more uncomfortable, than either his defenders or his accusers usually admit. On the question of whether Donitz had ordered the killing of survivors, the court found the evidence fell short of the certainty required, while adding that the orders were undoubtedly ambiguous and deserved the strongest censure. Then the tribunal did something extraordinary. It noted that because a British Admiralty order of May 1940 had directed that ships be sunk on sight within a certain zone, and because the United States had itself waged unrestricted submarine warfare across the Pacific from the very first day of that war, Donitz's sentence would not be assessed on the ground of his breaches of the international law of submarine warfare. Weigh that a second time. The court convicted Donitz, handing him 10 years, yet it openly declined to punish him for how he had fought the U-boat war, because the victors had fought their own submarine wars in precisely the same way. The most feared weapon of the Atlantic turned out, in the end, to be a weapon whose worst practices the winning side could not condemn without condemning themselves. The tragedy of the U-boat arm, viewed purely as a matter of engineering, is that the weapon which might actually have mattered arrived only once the war was already lost. That weapon was the Type 21, the Electroboot, the electric boat. Where every earlier submarine amounted to a surface ship that could duck under briefly, the Type 21 was the first true submarine built to live and fight beneath the waves, carrying a huge battery, a snorkel to run its diesels while submerged, and an underwater speed that could outrun many of its hunters. On paper it stood a full generation ahead of anything chasing it, and around 118 were built between 1943 and 1945. Here is the number that shrinks the Type 21 from menace to footnote. Of those 118 boats, only about 2 ever set out on a war patrol, and not one engaged in combat before Germany surrendered. Rushed into mass production far too late, the boats came riddled with mechanical faults, and the revolutionary submarine that might have reopened the Atlantic never fired a torpedo in anger. It tempts you to imagine that an earlier Type 21, arriving 2 years sooner, would have changed everything. That same historian who dismantled the almost one myth dismantles this consolation too. Clay Blair argued that even an earlier arrival of the advanced boats would have made no difference, because the problem was never the quality of the individual weapon. The problem stayed, start to finish, the arithmetic. Germany could not build submarines faster than the Allies built cargo ships, could not keep its ciphers secret, could not stop its own radios from betraying its boats, and could not outproduce a continental economy that stamped out Liberty ships 3 every 2 days. A better submarine, arriving late into that machine, would only have died faster and at greater cost. The Type 21 is the last if only of the U-boat war, and like every if only before it, it shatters against the same wall of numbers. The end came in May of 1945. On the 8th of May, Germany surrendered, and the U-boat fleet either surrendered or scuttled itself, with more than 150 submarines sent to the bottom by their own crews in the northern German ports rather than handed over intact. The boats that did surrender were mostly gathered up and, over the following year, sunk by the Allies in an operation named Deadlight, around 116 of them towed out to sea and put under the waves for good. Of the more than 1,100 U-boats ever built, only a handful survive anywhere on the planet today. One of them, U-995, a Type 7, rests as a museum ship at the Le Beau Naval Memorial near Kiel, the only surviving example of the very type that fought the Wolfpack battles. Another, U-505, captured in 1944, stands preserved in Chicago. The Le Beau Memorial itself, a tower begun before the war, was eventually rededicated to the sailors of every nation lost at sea, which makes it a fitting place for the U-boat to come to rest, a weapon of one navy left standing as a monument to the drowned of all of them. The memory that endures owes less to the archives than to a single film. The novel Das Boot, drawn from the war patrol of U-96, became the film, released in 1981, that fixed the U-boat in the popular imagination, the claustrophobia, the terror, the 3/4 of the crews who never came back. For millions of people that film simply is the Battle of the Atlantic. It is worth noticing that the most honest cultural memory of the U-boat war carries no triumph in it at all, only young men dying in a steel tube for a campaign the mathematics had already lost. So return to where all of this began, to Black May of 1943, to the 40-odd boats lost inside a month, to an admiral pulling his fleet off the very ocean he had promised to close. The Wolfpacks live in memory as the force that almost won the Atlantic. The record shows something else, a weapon that never held the numbers, never kept its secrets, never outbuilt its enemy, and threw its most terrifying lunge only after it had already been beaten. The fear was real. Winston Churchill was not inventing anything when he named the U-boat peril the thing that frightened him most through the whole war. Fear, though, measures what men believed, not what was true, and 99 of every 100 convoy ships still reached port while the shelf refilled faster than the Wolfpacks could ever empty it. The almost was manufactured out of genuine terror and decades of enforced silence about the codebreakers who really won the war. That leaves one last thing worth sitting with. If the most feared weapon of the Second World War never actually came close to winning, if the almost was only ever an illusion assembled from fear and secrecy, then it is worth asking how many of the other certainties we hold about that war are also just the residue of what frightened people at the time, hardened into fact long before anyone was ever allowed to check the numbers.